Chapter 21 Winning or Losing, What's Next? In this chapter, initiating with funders post-submission, planning for post-award grant reporting, turning funding rejections into future opportunities. Have you heard the saying, it's not over until the fat lady sings well in the world of grant seeking? It's not over until you know the fate of your grant request and have carried out the post-notification tasks. I have seen many grant writers, administrators, and boards of directors drop the ball after finding out that a request for funding was rejected. When I fail, I want to have a major meltdown and just cry. However, there is no time for a pity party or speeding through a box of tissues. Grant writers must decide on, or at least have a thorough process for, a win or lose communications plan. This chapter guides you through the steps you should take, win or lose. Handling funding status communications from grant makers. When the word finally reaches you that your grant proposal has been selected for funding, shout, do a happy dance, call colleagues and community partners, and plan a celebration. But then get ready to hunker down and begin the post-award process. First and foremost, your governing body needs to know so they can enter a resolution to accept the grant award. Next, you need to let the granting agency know that you accept the monies. Most important, you need to know how to report the windfall to your external stakeholders and set up a process for managing the money if you don't already have one in place. Drafting a resolution. Any agency with a board of directors, such as a non-profit, school district, or hospital, or trustees, or any government agency with a decision-making body, such as a city council, town board, or county board of supervisors, may be required to adopt resolutions to apply for and accept grant funds after an official letter has been received announcing a forthcoming award. Even if the funding source includes a check with the award announcement letter, foundations and corporations occasionally do this. Government organizations need a formal resolution before the check is deposited. Make sure to check with the funding agency and your governing body to see if any of these resolutions are required, if they are on file, and if they must be attached to your grant application or signed grant agreement. The resolution should include the name of the agency receiving the grant funds, the name of the funding agency, the amount of the funding awarded, and the intended use of the funding. Here's an example. The Lively Minds Institute hereby resolves to accept $100,000 from the International Association of Advanced Brainiacs for the 2021 to 2025 5-year institutional support initiative. These funds shall be used exclusively for this project. Approved unanimously by the What Do You Know Institute's Board of Directors on the 30th of November 2020. Signed by Billy Bravo, founder and executive director, Lively Minds Institute. The funder absolutely needs to see the original signature on the resolution, so either mail the original resolution or email a scan of the original resolution to the funding source. Be sure to keep a copy for your own files as well. Accepting the award. During the post-award process, you must inform the funding source that you accept its offer of funding before you can share the good news with the world. The following steps secure your role as the grant recipient. Notify all your administrators, including the Chief Financial Officer, CFO, of the award. Add the item Accept Grant Funds to the agenda of your Board of Directors' next meeting. Prepare an overview of the grant request document for board review prior to the meeting. In the overview, include the purpose, objectives, timelines for program implementation, project budget, and a copy of the official award letter from the funding source. Prepare a brief oral presentation to give to the board and draft the resolution language. The resolution is to accept the grant award. See the next section for more on drafting resolutions. If grant agreement forms need to be signed, have these documents ready for the board. Prepare a press release, provided the funder doesn't want anonymity, for board approval. As I note in Chapter 20, your senator or representative may take care of the press release if your grant is government funded. Before you make any in-house press release public, verify whether the funder, specifically, foundations and corporations, requires prior approval. Many funders stipulate that they must approve grantee press releases before a release is officially issued. Create or purchase a certificate of appreciation for foundation and corporate funders and get it signed by your board officers. Your CEO or board president can also write a formal letter of thanks. Skip this step if you're dealing with government agencies. Meet with the CFO to discuss fiscal accountability, including creating a clear or single audit trail. See the latest section reviewing post-award guidelines for help with financial reporting for more on these audits. Tackling the grant management process. What is grant management? First, it's making sure you keep all the promises you wrote in the program design narrative of your grant application. See Chapter 16 for details on the program design section. Second, it's handling all the funders' reporting requirements. Sometimes the grant writer assumes this responsibility, other times, these tasks are divvied up between the grant program manager or project director and the person who makes the financial decisions for your organization, the CFO or business manager. In smaller organizations, the CFO may be a bookkeeper working in concert with an executive director. In larger organizations, entire departments may handle the finances, including fiscal reporting. The grant program manager or project director is the person responsible for overseeing the implementation of the grant-funded activities. This person brings the program design narrative in the grant proposal to life. They're responsible for ensuring that all the tasks, process objectives, outlined in the program design's timeline table are accomplished on time. Other tasks for the grant program manager or grant project director include the following: meeting with collaborative partners to let them know the grant request was funded and working with them to plot out the action steps needed from partners. Meeting with the Human Resources Department to start the recruitment, screening, and hiring or reassigning of the grant-funded project staff. Meeting with the third-party evaluator, if applicable, to begin strategizing the monitoring and evaluating process for the SMART and promised outcomes, which I cover in Chapter 16. Orienting project staff to the purpose of the grant-funded project and giving them a copy of the program design narrative so that they can see how the project should unfold during the implementation process. Sharing the evaluation process with the project staff and the collaborative partners so that everyone knows what will be monitored, how the data will be collected and reported, and the role of each stakeholder in the feedback process. Making sure that staff adheres to all task activity timelines, and developing a corrective action plan to assure that the SMART or outcome objectives will be met before the end of the grant funding period if the timelines go off track. Working with the CFO or business manager to compile interim and final financial reports for the funder, see the next section. Preparing an end-of-project report for all stakeholders, including the board of directors and collaborative partners. Reviewing post-award guidelines for help with financial reporting. In federal grants, the Office of Management and Budget, OM, works cooperatively with funding agencies to establish government-wide grant management policies and guidelines. These guidelines are published in circulars and common rules. At the federal level, these documents are first introduced in the Federal Register, www.federalregister.gov, the Daily Journal of the United States Government. Table 21-1 lists the most commonly used federal grant management OM circulars. The circular numbers are the keys to locating the document on the OM website. To explore the circulars yourself, visit www.whitehouse.gov/OM/circulars. At the state funding level, the funding agency provides you with the funding stipulations, including the regulations for accessing, spending, reporting, and closing out grant funds. Foundation and corporate funders give you their funding stipulations and/or regulations, if any, when the funds are awarded. Other than asking you to sign a grant agreement, a contract indicating that you'll use the awarded funds as promised in your grant application, most private sector funders don't have a ton of regulations and usually spell out any stipulations in the grant agreement. As you read the circulars and guidelines, you may come across some unfamiliar terms. Fiscal accountability is the obligation to ensure that the funds granted are used correctly. Fiscal accountability lies with the entity responsible for managing the grant funds. Usually, that's the grant applicant, but in some instances it's the fiscal sponsor. Chapter 18 explores what it means to be a fiscal sponsor for a non-profit organization. Fiscal accountability means establishing an audit trail. A clear or single audit trail is an arrangement that allows any auditor, whether internal or from the funding source, to track the grant monies from the money in stage to the money out stage without finding that grant funds have been commingled with other organizational funds. Review the grant agreement from the funder. Many require that any grant funds received should be deposited into a separate account and tracked individually by using accounting practices that enable tracking by date, by expenditure, and by line item allocation against the approved project budget, which is the budget that was approved by the funding source. However, not all funders require separate accounting. Handling multiple grant awards. Suppose you've applied for grants with 20 potential funding sources. One of the 20 funding sources funds you in full. The money has been deposited, and your project is up and running. But more mail comes in, and guess what? Your project has received 2 more grants, totaling an amount equal to the full funding requests. You must have written one fabulous narrative. If your project is overfunded, here's what to do: immediately contact each funder and explain your predicament. Ask the funders permission to keep the funds and expand your project's design. Ask the funders permission to carry grant monies over into another fiscal year. The worst-case scenario is that all funding sources except for the first funder ask you to return the additional funding. The best-case scenario is that you're allowed to keep the funding and create a bigger and better project or program. The best way to avoid the predicament of having too much money is to write a letter to each outstanding funding sources that haven't communicated with you on their decisions to fund your grant requests, immediately after you know that you have full funding. Be honest and quick. It's the right and ethical thing to do, even though having too much money sounds like a good thing. Chapter 18 talks more about the ethical approach to grant seeking. Failing to get a grant award. Failed efforts in the grant writing field are upsetting, but remember that they don't signal the end of your grant writing career. After all, just because a grant proposal isn't funded doesn't mean it doesn't have some salvageable parts. This section helps you look at why your application failed and then plan how to fix it. Requesting peer review comments when your government application is rejected. If your grant application was rejected by a state or federal funding agency, you're entitled to review the grant reviewer's comments under the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. Unfortunately, if you're rejected by a foundation or corporate giving entity, you probably won't receive any reviewer's comments, and you can't use the FOIA to get them. Chapter 20 covers the type of communication you can expect from a foundation or corporation when you aren't funded. Government agencies, especially federal ones, typically send a summary sheet with the section scores and an overview of strengths and weaknesses of each application section. If you receive a rejection notice from a state or federal funding agency that doesn't include such a summary, or if the summary doesn't give you enough information, write a letter requesting the peer reviewer's comments. Each federal grant application usually has 3 peer reviewers. When you use the FOIA, you receive the federal peer reviewer's actual written comments and scores, the points they bestowed on each narrative section in your grant application. For more information on the federal peer review process, head to Chapter 11. In order to invoke the FOIA, your letter should include the following information, at a minimum, to assist the funding agency in locating your requested documents: the name of the federal funding agency from which you're seeking the information. This name must be in the address section of the letter and on your envelope. You can also email your letter to the granting agency's contact person. You can usually find the contact person's email address in the grant application announcement or on the funding agency's website. The application identification code. At the federal level, when your application is uploaded to the GrantsGov system, you'll receive an email notice that it has been received by the agency. This notice contains an identifying number for tracking your grant application. If you don't receive this notice or lose the email, you can log into GrantsGov and click the Applicants tab to see the drop-down lists. Click How to apply for grants and then choose the Track Application option. When you click this link, you see the information shown in Figure 21-1. Source: www.grants.gov/web/grants/track-my-application.html. Figure 21-1, the Track My Application package on GrantsGov. Address your letter to the funding agency program officer listed as the contact person in the grant application guidelines. On the envelope and at the top of your FOIA letter or in the subject line of your email message, write Freedom of Information Act requests. Save a copy of your requests. You may need it in the event of an appeal or if your original request isn't answered. Federal agencies are required to answer your request for information within 10 working days of receipt. If you don't receive a reply by the end of that time frame, including mailing time, if applicable, You may write a follow-up email attaching your FOIA letter again and reminding them of the date on the letter, or call the agency to ask about the delay. Other government agencies have their own set time frames for replies. Calling and asking before writing your letter is the best way to find out how long you should wait for a reply. You can try to contact the funding agency's program officer to request written feedback on your failed grant application. However, if you don't receive your feedback in 90 days or less via email or mail, begin to formulate your FOIA letter. Acting fast to reuse a failed government requests. After you receive the peer review comments for a rejected public sector grant application, see the preceding section. Use them to find out what your peers found wrong with the application's narrative sections. Correct the weaknesses, and if parts of your sections were confusing or incomplete, rewrite them. If other people helped you put the application narrative together, now's the time to reconvene the grant writing team. If you're stuck holding a failed grant request, why are you doing all this work? Here's why: to get the grant ready for resubmission to the same federal or state grant competition when it cycles again, which is usually once per federal or state fiscal year. To make sure you have a great working document for cutting, pasting, and reworking into state, foundation, and corporate grant application formats. However, face the facts. You went to the feds or the state government because you needed mega monies for your project. No other single funding source can fill the gap that a federal or state grant award would have filled. Consequently, you need to scale down your project design and project budget when you take your request to private sector funding sources. Base your adjustments on each funding source's limitations, which you uncover through research. For example, say you ask for $850,000 to clean up contaminated soil near a city playground in your government grant requests. Of the $850,000, $150,000 is needed for soil sampling and preparation to decrease surface level contaminants. Look at all your line items. Which ones can be standalone line items? Can the project be started in phases? If yes, then target funders to fund each specific phase. Although this will be a much slower start to finish process, at least the project will be completed and eventually benefit an entire community. In Chapter 4, I tell you how to find state and federal level grant opportunities. Chapter 6 covers how to find out about foundation and corporate funding sources. Dealing with failed foundation or corporate funding requests. Program officers from local foundations are usually more than willing to discuss the reasons a proposal was denied. However, some foundations and corporations that fund throughout the nation explicitly state that due to the volume of grant applications anticipated, they won't provide feedback on declined applications. Never, ever throw a rejected foundation or corporate grant request into your files, walk away, and give up. Instead, do the following: go back and do another funding search to identify a new list of foundation and corporate funders you can approach with your grant requests. See Chapter 6 for more about private sector funds. Convene your stakeholders planning team to discuss the failed attempt with the first funder or funders. Sometimes, other people in the community have funding leads to share with you. After all, they want to see your project funded as much as you do. Beef up your original foundation or corporate proposal to meet the requirements of state or federal funding opportunities. This means writing more narrative and adding more research to support your statement of need. You also need a new project budget based on federal or state funding limitations. Foundations or corporate giving entities probably won't provide reviewers' comments. The Freedom of Information Act applies only to grant applications submitted to local, county, state, and federal government agencies.